Right, the long-awaited sequel to A Brief History of the Nature argument comes A Brief History of the Nurture argument. Remember, we have to understand the classic nature versus nurture debate. We all understand it intrinsically, intuitively, but can you explain it in detail? So we've looked at nature, right? The nature argument is our behavior is a product of our nature, our internal characteristics, our biology. The opposite side of the debate that for 100 years they argued, well, actually it's a product of your upbringing, of your nurture. And I originally said, 2 to 3 arguments here. I think we can do this with behaviorism, social learning theory, and social cognitive theory. Okay, you can talk about culture if you like, but we're going to focus on these two. We're going to look at the interactions between these, so that's where we bring in social cognitive theory and some evaluation. All right, so by the end of this video, hopefully, you can explain and evaluate the key arguments of the nurture argument, use the studies and theories, explain how it's actually, though, we now understand it's both, and you can look at some interactions between nature and nurture. Alright, so this is the achievement criteria. You can hit pause if you want to see here how you're going to achieve excellence. All of you can become excellent psychologists. It's actually this would be one of the easier, I think, standards to gain excellence in. The studies and theories, that's pretty straightforward, right? This is the big focus in psychology. You can't study psychology without using theories and studies, really. And the interaction of the arguments, again, very straightforward. If you understand the arguments, you can see how they interact. And the evaluation, I think this is going to be pretty straightforward. So we'll come to that at the end of the video. Right, so is behavior nature or nurture? That's what we're looking at. The nature argument, we're going to break it down into conditioning, right? Your behavior is a product of your conditioning, and this is the key claim in behaviorism, right? There was the biggest field of psychology for most of the 1900s. And then sort of changed with the introduction of social learning theory by Bandura. Okay, that's the second claim we're going to look at, and then he changed himself, the name of his theory, to social cognitive theory. So we've got behaviorism, social learning theory, and social cognitive theory. So we begin with behaviorism. This is John Watson, the father of behaviorism, and his famous study with little Albert, which you'll remember. So this is the man here, and if you want to use these slides, you can find them on Schoolbox, and you can see this video on YouTube. Alright, so now Watson was reacting to Freud and the early psychologists, remember, and he was saying, look, behaviorism is about studying observable actions. That's why it's called behavior actions, right? He didn't want to study the mind because we couldn't see it, and so he wanted to focus just on what we could observe. So this is why he chose to demonstrate this with little Albert, right? And this is why he recorded it. He said, look, this is how we do the scientific method. We can observe these behaviors, and that's what we're going to study. Go away, you video. Okay, and so first, let's talk the behaviorism is 2 parts: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning began, so Watson was also inspired by Pavlov. And in Pavlov's famous dog experiment, okay, again, you'll understand how this works, but putting it into words can be a little bit tricky. All right, so I'll try to make it simple if you can remember this one sentence. So we've got behavior, right? That's what we're trying to explain, is caused by we create a learned behavior. So we take a neutral stimulus, so a stimulus, something that doesn't create any response, and we couple it with an unconditioned stimulus, right? And if we do that again and again and again, then we're going to develop a conditioned response, okay? So behavior is caused by creating a learned behavior, right? So that's our learned behavior, that's our conditioned response, right? By pairing a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus and conditioned response to develop a conditioned response. Okay, so again, and we'll talk about this with little Albert. So we take the neutral stimulus of a bell, all right, and so if we ring that enough in coupling with the unconditioned response of salivating when food comes, well, eventually, right, we can, because we've associated these 2 things here, the food with the bell, if we remove the food and we just ring the bell, we can generate the same response. Okay, so Watson was inspired by this experiment by Pavlov. That's what he tried to do with little Albert. It's always seemed to be far more menacing. Remember, they never hit the baby, right? What they did was they exposed little Albert to an unconditioned stimulus, a neutral stimulus, sorry. Let's say, for example, a rabbit. So a neutral stimulus didn't generate any fear at all in little Albert. But they paired that with a unconditioned response, smacking a loud bar, right? Sorry, an unconditioned stimulus, smacking a loud bar, which created an unconditioned response. Crying, that's just natural, right? That's not a conditioned response, that's a natural response, right? Just crying when you smack a loud bar. If you do that repeatedly, the rabbit with the loud bar, rabbit with the loud bar. Eventually you get the conditioned response, which means show the rabbit, now you don't even have to smack the loud bar, you're going to get little Albert crying. Okay, now that's how classical conditioning works. This can be a little bit tricky to put into words, all right? I get that. So you might want to focus more on and go into more detail with operant conditioning, which is a little bit easier to explain. But hopefully, especially if you're aiming for excellence, you can summarize the classical conditioning process and use little Albert. Okay, so practice writing and explaining little Albert's experiment to demonstrate classical conditioning. Now here's a couple of interesting things that actually our brain, and we know this from fMRI studies, that our brain is heavily involved in the conditioning response. So our hippocampus is associated with memory and amygdala with emotion. And so if you are being conditioned to fear something, and they do this, if you're being conditioned to fear something, your amygdala and your hippocampi are activated, right? These are the parts of the brain associated with creating that conditioned response. So little Albert's amygdala and hippocampi would have been going crazy, right, during that conditioning. So what they do is they put people in fMRIs and they measure their brain while they are being conditioned to fear little electric shocks on their fingers. And that's how they measure what's happening in the brain. So this is really interesting because this actually gives us some insight. So one of the strengths of behaviorism could be that we could actually use it to understand, for example, PTSD, because fear conditioning and a conditioned fear response can explain the symptoms of PTSD. And so it kind of could show like a change in behaviorism, in that now behaviorists could kind of focus on what's going on in the brain. But also it shows an interaction, right, between the nature, what's happening in the brain, and nurture, the conditioning. Both of these things are working together in order to create the conditioned response, right? But that also shows a limitation, right, in focusing on just the conditioning and ignoring what's happening in the brain whilst we're having that conditioned response. Okay, so it's important there, yeah. So we've got the conditioning process, but also the brain is heavily involved in that conditioning. Another limitation there, actually, just while I think about it, is, and some of you have pointed this out in class, this is only about fear. Could this explain all types of behavior, right? A little bit tricky, right? Are we conditioned to experience love? Are we conditioned for anger and aggression, right? Or are these impulsive, instinctive emotions? So operant conditioning, this came out of the classical conditioning studies, and the reason it's called operant conditioning is because behavior operates in reaction to the environment, and the environment here is rewards and punishments. Rewards, if you get rewarded for a behavior, you're going to do more of the same. Punishment, you're going to do less of the same. All right. Okay, and this is the guy who came up with operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner. He was a student of Watson's, and so just like Watson was inspired by Pavlov, Skinner was inspired by his teacher, Watson, and he came up with operant conditioning. Again, it's conditioning not with just associating one stimuli with another, but it's about rewards and punishments. And he used a lot of animal studies, most famously pigeons and rats. We've seen this video, you can watch it again, but this is one of his studies where he showed you can train a pigeon to turn in a circle by simply every time it does a random movement one side, you give it a reward. And then you wait until it repeats that movement and you give it another reward. And eventually, if you do that again and again and again, you're going to condition that pigeon to turn in a complete circle. Remember, Skinner tried to get funding from, actually he did, I think, got funding from the American government to train pigeons to drop bombs, but unfortunately the experiment was canned. I don't know if that unfortunately, probably fortunately. Anyway, social learning theory. So this again was a reaction to behaviorism, and this came out in the 1960s, 1970s. Okay, so social learning theory is all about observational learning. So Bandura, who we'll talk about in a moment, here we are. So Bandura said, yes, behavior can be conditioned. He didn't argue against that, but he said, but it also can come out of observation. Okay, and so Freud was saying our behavior is a product of our innate characteristics based on our childhood experiences. Behaviorism is about conditioning. Bandura said, yes, but also we can see it and we do it. All right, so behavior is learned through observation. And this is a key change in the nurture debate, that it added an additional explanation to conditioning. All right, so this is the man himself here. And so his key theory was that we learn by watching models, right? Modeling of behavior, and we imitate it. And you can probably relate this to your own experience. How often have you grown up watching an older brother, a sibling, a parent, and you copy their behavior? So 4 factors influence whether or not observation leads to imitation. If you can remember these, fantastic. Reinforcement, so he did agree, rewards and punishments will influence whether or not you, and especially if you watch someone being punished for a behavior, you're probably not going to repeat it. If you watch someone and they get rewarded for their behavior, you're more likely to repeat it. If you identify with a model, so remember in the Bobo doll studies, boys more likely to copy the men, and the girls more likely to copy the women, all right? And if you like the model, and motor reproduction means if you can physically reproduce the task, all right? So my 2 oldest kids will try to do yoga with me. My baby does not. Lazy little bugger. No, because he can't, right? He physically can't. He doesn't know what's going on. So if you can't physically reproduce the action, you're not likely to repeat it, all right? The classic Bobo doll studies, you guys know these in and out, right? They watch a model, either 2 conditions. 1, the model is beating up the doll, or in another condition, the model is playing nicely with the doll. Those who watch the aggressive model, far more likely to be aggressive themselves, right? There's no rewards or punishments for the behavior. There's no conditioning here. It's just simply observation, all right? So that supports this idea of social learning. Here's the link here to watch the study, or again, that video, right? But should be able to remember it. Now, 20 years later, in the 1980s, Bandura actually updated his theory, all right, again, a significant change, in renaming it social cognitive theory. And what he wanted to do here was highlight the internal decision-making processes that can actually go into imitating behavior. And he wanted to add this concept of triadic reciprocal determinism. So he was saying, look, it's probably not just monkey see, monkey do, we just repeat it's not just rote imitation or basic imitation, but we can actually kind of think about it and process it. And there's these internal cognitive factors, right? Our thinking processes might also influence our behavior. So this triadic reciprocal determinism is saying, look, our behavior is actually, it's a triad. There are 3 factors involved. The behavior, the internal factors, biological, cognitive, right? Psychological factors, and our environmental, external factors. Reciprocal meaning all of these things can influence one another, and they determine our behavior. So neuroplasticity is an example of this. Our environment shapes the brain, which can affect our behavior. Also, epigenetics, our environment can influence our genetics, which influences our behavior. Right? So social cognitive theory shows a key shift in the nurture debate because it actually acknowledges, hey, this is probably a combination of factors. So it highlights also a limitation in the nurture debate because it's saying, look, yeah, even Bandura himself, who was originally on the side of it's a product of nurture, is admitting, well, actually, there's probably nature involved as well. All right? So that's why he changed the name of his theory. Right? So as I just said, we can have some examples of interactions in the nurture debate if we can look at the brain. The amygdala and hippocampus is involved in the conditioning process. I believe even the prefrontal cortex is involved too. Social cognitive theory's triadic reciprocal determinism, right, can also highlight the interaction between nurture and nature. So in summary, right, what we can see here is the summary of the nurture argument is that behavior is a product of our environment, right, conditioning and observational learning. But is that all there is? Think about how complex behaviors are and think of the range of behaviors we study in psychology. Love, attraction, aggression, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders. Are these all a product of observational learning and conditioning? Probably not, right? And then that's one of the key limitations. So behaviorism is being critiqued for focusing too much on too little, right? So they focus too much on conditioning. Everything. B.F. Skinner got to the point where he said language was caused by conditioning. It's all just rewards and punishments. You just randomly say words until you get rewarded for using the right one, and then that's how you're going to learn how to speak. Well, we know that's not the case, right? There's way more that goes into it than that. So behaviorism, it just focuses on conditioning, but we know that's not going to explain all behaviors. That's what we mean by focuses too much on too little. Too little is the conditioning, and that's all they cared about. Look at the animal studies. Okay, sure, you can condition and reward a pigeon to turn in a circle. Is that going to explain why someone is going to develop post-traumatic stress disorder? Is that going to explain why someone would murder someone? A big difference, big leap, going from explaining giving a treat for a pigeon to turn in a circle to rewarding and getting, like, someone murdering someone is going to be based on their, like, rewards that they've had growing up. Right. And again, as I said, conditioning and the brain, right? So we can't ignore what's happening in the brain when we are experiencing conditioning. Same thing possibly with observational learning, right? There's definitely going to be brain activity happening when we're observing someone. And so, yeah, we know from mirror neurons, for example, right? Our brain lights up when we observe someone doing the same action as us. So we can't just focus on the environmental factors. And as I said before, social cognitive theory highlights the problem with social learning theory, in that social learning theory ignored the internal cognitive factors. So hopefully there's enough there to evaluate from the nurture argument. We can say that, look, it's reductionist because it's just focusing on two very specific explanations, observational learning and conditioning, and ignoring all other factors. And if you can give some examples of that, and then also like the methodology. You might be able to think of some other limitations as well. Can you think of limitations of the Bobo dog study, of the little Albert study? Not ethical considerations, but more the validity, right? We're making these big generalizations that behavior is a product of nurture based on those very basic studies. So some tips and how do you put that all together in an essay evaluating the nurture argument? Well, focus on the three arguments: behaviorism, classical and operant conditioning. Can you explain those? Social learning theory, can you explain it? And social cognitive theory. I've given you all the information in this video that you need to explain those three things. Use the studies that we've mentioned. And here's, you need to explain how it changed over time. Can you explain how Skinner was a reaction to Watson, right? Or a development, I should say, of Watson. Can you explain how Bandura was a reaction to Skinner and Watson, right? So Bandura was a reaction to behaviorism, right? Rewind the video if you need to see that again. And then even Bandura reacted to himself by changing the name of his theory. So there are three key ways in which the nurture argument changed over time, right? And we've talked about the interactions and the evaluation. Many of you are stressed about your assessment. You're like, do I really have to remember all this? Remember, assessments are designed to see how much you've learned. And if you can't remember it, you haven't learned it. Hard work, boys. It's a matter of, well, if you got to this point in the video, good luck. I know you're working hard, so you'll do great. And that's all. Right, sorry, this is 7 a.m. in the morning and my brain's fried. Good luck.